Welcome to this recorded webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the issue of consistent baselines and how we can achieve alignment in the region. My name is Carrie Cobb and I'm the Market Research Lead at Bonneville Power, and I oversee our momentum savings analysis and work. And the reason that we're discussing the issue of baseline alignment at this time is that about a year ago, in the fall of 2014, Public Utilities asked Bonneville to report momentum savings. And as we did the work to figure out how we would technically do that, we realized that one of the biggest technical barriers to reporting momentum savings to utilities was the issue of baseline misalignment. Momentum savings analysis relies on the baseline for the calculation, and when that baseline is different, the calculation is wrong, and therefore the savings are inaccurate. So today what we're going to talk to is, first we're going to give some context on why Bonneville does the work to quantify momentum savings. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about what momentum savings are and how they align up with the baseline, with different baselines. And then I'm going to give an overview of our proposal for a path forward. So to start off, I just want to level set everyone on the criteria that we use for momentum savings. So momentum savings are not directly paid for by programs, and they're not claimed in NEIA's net market effects. So they are savings outside of our direct programmatic incentives and current interventions. They are also cost effective. So if a measure is not deemed cost effective by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council or by the Regional Technical Forum, we don't include that measure in our analysis. And it is always measured relative to a frozen baseline. So for us, that is the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's 6th plan baseline right now, and soon to be 7th plan baseline. And it could be any baseline, it just needs to be a frozen baseline. Part of the context of how and why we quantify momentum savings is that there's many mechanisms for energy efficiency. So we can get energy efficiency through our program efforts. We can get them through NEIA's program efforts and market transformation. We can also see regulation changes and legislation changes that lead to codes and standards that create savings relative to our frozen baseline. And then we also see activity that just occurs in the market that may be influenced by our programs, maybe a type of spillover, but is not counted as part of the either our program bucket, NEIA, or codes and standards. And that's our market-induced bucket. Momentum savings tracks the market-induced and codes and standards. And we do this primarily for having a more accurate look at what the total energy efficiency resources in the region. What we found as we've started doing our projects is that there's a lot of energy efficiency that occurs outside of programs, and understanding that efficiency gives us a more accurate view of the resource that's available to the region. So one example is a recent project where we quantified all of the appliance standards that went into effect since the 6th plan baseline was set. And that project told us that a huge amount of savings, enough to power 1,000 homes in the next 20 years, came from federal standards. And we gave that information to the Power Council, who then implemented that into their load forecast. And it changed the line of load that would be required in the region in the future. These amounts of energy efficiency are significant. They change our load forecast, and as we gain more experience over time with different markets and different measures, that's the type of information that we want to make sure that we share with load forecasters so that we can accurately predict our future load needs. We also do momentum savings research in order to identify program opportunities and to support programs. So part of the work that we do, because we do a total market analysis, is we look at inefficient and efficient products. And so the inherent nature of our work is that we end up stumbling upon areas where efficiency isn't working the way that we would like to see it work. So one example of this is in the maintenance market for linear fluorescent. So when we did our analysis, what we found is that a big chunk of the potential energy savings was happening in the maintenance market. So the market lamp sales to maintenance were from 60 to 75% of the total sales, depending upon the product. So what that means is with our programs, we had always been focused on system change out. So that's looking at a linear fluorescent, maybe it's a T12 system, and upgrading that to a T8 system. But in between system change outs, there's lamp change outs as lamps die or as they do planned replacement. And we found that the market was overwhelmingly 32 watt T8, which helped justify NEIA's low wattage T8 program, which is now currently working to drive that average efficiency down to a low wattage of 28 or 25 watt as the standard practice. Another area where we identify program opportunities and support programs is through our baseline work. So we recently completed analysis of the baseline for the RTF for residential lighting. And in that work, we found that 73% of the specialty bulbs are still incandescent and halogen that were sold in 2014. And by providing that information and that analysis, not only do we see that there remains an opportunity to create more efficiency in the market, but we also support those measures so they can keep going forward. Another reason that we look at momentum savings is to focus our resources. And sometimes that means saying no to some things. So not all efficiency opportunities are opportunities that we should go after. One example is Energy Star lamps. So right now there's a big movement with LEDs to drive down prices where there are lamps that are being sold that are not Energy Star. So they have a high efficacy, but the lifetime is shorter than the Energy Star spec, and the lamps aren't omnidirectional. And while these provide a good option in the marketplace for a low-cost LED, they are not pushing the market to a better lamp, a long-life lamp, and might not be a great place for us to invest our program dollars. So because we can still claim the savings from the cheaper lamps, we don't need to invest our dollars there. We can make that choice if it lines up with our program strategy, but it's not something that we have to do in order to meet our targets. Another area where we've changed our program investment has been in converting T12s. So when we went and we looked at the sales data, we found that T12s are a really small portion of total linear fluorescent sales. They're about 7%. And most lamps sold are 32 watt T8. Because of that data, we realized that T12s were really the obsolete technology, and that a current practice baseline of 32 watts was more appropriate for linear fluorescence. So we did that baseline shift and are now pushing the market to go to higher efficiency LEDs. So the reason that we do all of this, to know the total energy efficiency so we have a more accurate understanding of the total market, identify program opportunities, support our program baseline work, and say no to some efficiency purchases is because is to be a responsible steward of ratepayer funds. So it's all about getting the most energy efficiency for the least cost. And the reason that this ties up with the public utilities is that Bonneville, doing momentum savings work by itself, Bonneville does not serve energy efficiency directly to the region. The utilities deliver the region's energy efficiency. And so supporting the utilities in being able to capture momentum savings and be strategic with their investments is going to help us all stay aligned and working towards a common goal. So I'm going to switch now and talk a little bit about what are the different baselines. So baselines can be broken out into two different categories. One is the types of baselines, and the other is the uses. And the types are the different ways that we quantify the baseline. So that could be a pre-existing condition baseline, a counterfactual baseline, or a current practice baseline. So those use different analytical methods, and they're measuring different things. In contrast, uses are when they are used in different applications. So that would be like when the council has a baseline, and then utilities conservation potential assessments have a different baseline. The regional technical forum has a different baseline. And that tends to be at different time periods. So they're using the same type of baseline, but at a different point in time, and therefore get a different answer. So the type of baseline that we're going to focus on is the current practice baseline, because that is generally where you will see momentum savings. Momentum savings, it tends to be current practice baseline work. And this slide, what we're looking at is the number of sales of different products in the market and the efficacy of those sales, and then the average, which is where the baseline is set. So for general purpose 60 to 75 watt lamps, we see that CFLs and LEDs are the efficient technology, and then halogens and incandescents are the inefficient technology. And in the middle, we've got our average. And energy savings are then calculated from that average. So in this case, the CFLs, the delta between the average to where the CFL efficacy is, would be your energy savings, and the same with LED. Here we see a baseline for linear fluorescent, and in this baseline you've got the T12 and the T8 spike, and then your high performance T8 that's above the market average. You see that the market average is more leaning towards the right, but it's in the middle of all of the different products. So a use baseline is where you have different points in time where you're taking the same methodology, perhaps different data, but the same general method, and then you are re-estimating the baseline. So the council baseline stays flat for 6 years, where the utility CPA baselines change every biennium. So they quickly do not line up. So how baselines and momentum savings work together is that if we take the average of the market, so we're going to assume a bell curve, even though that isn't generally what sales look like, but that's the typical way that we express the average. So we take the average of the kilowatt hour consumption and create the council baseline. So then the momentum savings are calculated from that council baseline. So over time, the market changes and the market average shifts. So if we look at it on the perspective of the bienniums of the conservation potential assessments, we can see that when the council baseline was set, the average was where this lime green line is, and then consumption starts going down in that market. So the first biennium, the total market savings are the difference between the new market average and the old market average of the council baseline. And then it shifts again in the second biennium and the third biennium. And there's a couple points of this slide that I want to highlight. One is that we are re-estimating the market average over the course of time. So we're comparing it to a previous period in time, and that's giving the total market savings. The second point is that as we get further from that baseline, the savings grow. So the more time that elapses, the more that market changes, the bigger the savings. Now, if you have a CPA baseline, you would want to be in line with that market average, the most recent market average, because that is properly accounting for where your program should be working, which is above the average. So in this case, you can see that as the market average shifts, CPAs set their baselines in different spots, but if we report the total market savings back to utilities using the council baseline, we are then double counting the savings. We're essentially reporting those savings in the baseline and in the momentum savings. So it creates a double counting scenario that we wouldn't want to have happen. And here is another way of looking at it, which is our total market savings is the market average KWH minus the council baseline KWH. That could be a different baseline, and you'd still get, it's just defining your baselines differently. And then the momentum savings are the total market savings, and we pull out the program savings. So we pull out what we've already accounted for through our programmatic activity. And it's not, the issue of baselines not lining up is not just a momentum savings issue, it's also a NEA savings issue, and it's a program baseline issue. So when we did our first project estimating the savings from the non-residential lighting, we found that a lot of the savings were below the baseline. They were early retirement measures that were against a current pre-existing condition baseline that was less efficient than what the council assumed had already happened. And so that left about 20 average megawatts for the region below the baseline that we were not able to claim towards our council targets. So it's an issue that impacts programs, NEIA savings, and momentum savings. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept of efficiency assumed in the baseline. As the market shifts and as you're looking at a market on average, when the baseline is set, it's assuming that half of that market is already efficient. And so let's say that 10% of the market is assumed efficient in the baseline. That means that in year one, when those units are sold, that 10% of the market being efficient is sold, those savings are already assumed to have happened. They're not incremental savings above the baseline. The same with year two, and the same with year three. So it's not that this energy efficiency isn't happening and it's showing up on the grid. It's that we've already assumed that it would happen, and so it's put into the baseline. It's in essence removed from the potential. So how do we get alignment on this issue? Well, first I want to show a little bit about the different bienniums and how momentum savings would grow if the baseline remained static. So with a static baseline, over time, momentum savings get much larger. So these are rough percentages. These are not, it really depends on where the baseline is set and what baseline you're using in what market. But overall, you'd probably see in your first biennium, after the baseline was set, roughly about 10%. In your second biennium, it would grow roughly around 25%. And then your third biennium, you start seeing big momentum savings because you're so far out from the baseline at that point. So that would be more in the neighborhood of 40%. At the same time, while those momentum savings are happening, you should also be seeing that new efficiency opportunities are becoming available that weren't available at the time of the first biennium. So it might be that some measures have become cost effective that didn't used to be cost effective. Maybe there's new technologies, maybe there's new markets identified. So there's new things for people to be working on. Now, if we set the baseline biannually, what happens is essentially the momentum savings get subsumed into the efficiency that's assumed in the baseline. So they stay small over time. Even though they're still contributing the same amount of energy efficiency, it's below the baseline. So you have it's not showing up above the baseline. So it's staying at that 10%, at that small sliver, because there's not a whole lot of time for the entire market to shift. The one big thing about momentum savings is that we're not just taking the widgets that are above average efficiency and claiming those, multiplying them by the savings rate the way we do with our program savings. Momentum savings only get measured if you shift the entire market. So some solutions to get baseline alignment. So we have a proposal that we want to get public comment and feedback on. So the option that we've come up with is to develop a baseline library. And essentially what this would function as is a resource for utility CPAs that they could use or not use. And that additional baseline is something that Bonneville would then report momentum savings against. We do not have the resources or the bandwidth to be able to report against multiple utility CPA baselines, but we can report against one additional baseline in addition to the council baseline. So the baseline library would be a way for utility CPAs to access the most recent data that's available. It would be a resource that we would provide either via vehicles such as RTF measures, or we might have them on our webpage. There's a lot of different formats in which that would come available, but it would essentially be one baseline that we've all aligned and agreed on. And what it would do is it would take all of the different CPA baselines and we would unite in one baseline. So we would all come to one point of agreement, and then utilities could optionally use that in their CPAs. Part of this process would be that we would, Bonneville would work to facilitate communication to make sure that we understood the needs on timing, who we should be working with at the utility and with the CPA consultants, that information is getting transferred correctly, that we know what the requirements are, and then also that we go back and forth on how we would agree upon a common baseline. So we want to make sure that if we develop this, that this would be a resource that utilities could use and would use. And as we start the process of doing this, we will focus on the key measures. So in the short term, there's most of the savings are coming from lighting, some coming from HVAC. And then we also have the NEIA initiatives that we would partner with NEIA on identifying what those are and making sure that we got where the biggest discrepancy could occur. We get those lined up first. Then we would also make sure that utilities had all the information they needed on where there had been new codes and standards. Those wouldn't show up as momentum savings, but would help the baseline be more efficient in your CPAs. So our second option that we came up with is that we could continue to do nothing, but if we don't do anything, we would not be able to report momentum savings to utilities unless the utilities were also against the council baseline. So that is not the option we recommend. We recommend doing the baseline library. But again, this is a resource for utilities. And so it's up to utilities if we develop it or not. So we are opening this up for public comment. So we will be sending out instructions via the weekly announcements. And we'll have a web page that will have a short memo describing the baseline library. And we'll have the slides in this video available for review. We'll continue public comment throughout January, mid-January. And then once we have all the public comment, we will post it, and we will post a plan for action after a few weeks after the public comment closes. So if you have any questions, please email me at clcobb@bpa.gov. Thank you.